Welcome everyone to the Preschool Neuroscience Summit. Today I'm really excited to introduce you to Dr. Laura A Jana. She is from Jana Ventures and she just has an amazing amount of expertise in this area. So I'm really excited that she's here with us today. She's a pediatrician, she's an early educator, a health communicator. She's a nationally acclaimed parenting and children's book author, and she has a faculty appointment at Penn State University, Prevention and Research Center. She has written over 30 parenting and children's books, and her most recent book is perfect for the summit, The Toddler's Brain, Nurture the Skills Today That Will Shape Your Child's Tomorrow. And jumping into kindergarten as well. So it's fabulous to have you here. Thank you so much, Laura, for joining us today. Really appreciate it.
Oh, it's a pleasure to join you, and a great subject, so I'm looking forward to it.
Thanks. And I just want to remind everyone, we have all Dr. Laura's information, her social media, LinkedIn profile and everything, and website obviously, and she's very kindly given us some free resources. There's a TED Talk, 5 Connections That Will Change Children's Lives, and also a resource called Skills Every Child Will Need to Succeed in the 21st Century. So click on those and make sure you pick those up, because I'm sure they're great, full of great information as well. So let's start by, why has there suddenly been this big shift in the importance of the first 5 years? Like, it's in the media everywhere, we keep hearing about it, we know as early childhood educators, but why suddenly does society so interested in the first 5 years?
Well, you just made the point that I was going to lead with, which is, for anybody who's worked in early education or in early childhood, it's not a news flash that there's a lot of important things that happen in the first 5 years. But what I think has happened, quite frankly, is that the neuroscience got much better, right, at supporting what a lot of us already knew. So again, it's not new that what happened in the first 5 years, whether you're talking about early literacy or behaviors or any of those sorts of things, it's not news to us that happens during those years. Mm-hmm. But when the neuroscience started catching up, and a lot of people time that around the mid to late 90s, and of course, when something starts happening, it takes a while to permeate. Even, for example, in my profession in pediatrics, if something new comes out, whether it's a recommendation, I'm a spokesperson for the American Academy of Pediatrics. And so part of what I consider my job is to help convey changes in policy and recommendations. It takes years and years for that to permeate out even into the pediatric offices and then out to parents, right? Mm-hmm. So the neuroscience, there was sort of an explosion in understanding and neuroimaging and all sorts of ways of understanding the brain better in the 90s. And as that started to get applied into early childhood, our ability now to take something where, I usually in my talks, I often reference the, cooing with babies. If you all were watching me and I cooed to a baby and the baby cooed back at me, the general public might think I'm a very nice pediatrician from the Midwest in the US and I'm really good with babies. And I always say, and that may be true, but there's a lot more to it. There's a lot more going on. But before we had the ability to have neuroscience back us up, it was a little harder to convince people. Now, when we've got capabilities like magnetoencephalography, which actually is a type of neuroimaging that lets you see what's going on in a baby's brain in real time while they interact, for example, with their mother, all right? It's really a different discussion when you say, because people have a hard time arguing with neuroscience. So that's where I think what's happened is the neuroscience really supported what a lot of us already knew. My grandmother got her PhD in early education, but it was a very different prospect to convey that to the mainstream world about how important those early years are. Now it's exciting because everyone's starting to pay attention, and the value of what we do is not only the actual interactions with young children, but helping people understand how to have those positive interactions and just how important they are.
Yeah. I think it is so exciting. I think for all of us in the field, it's like, yay, the early years.
Exactly.
So tell us, what does the brain science say about this kind of critical period in children's lives?
Sure. And what I've learned to do, because what I've spent my time doing the last several years since I wrote The Toddler Brain, which is a book that actually is about 50% early brain and child development, early education, parenting, developmental milestones of early childhood, and 50% business, workforce, life sort of outcomes minded. And the goal was to put those two things together so people who weren't necessarily already invested in early childhood could understand why it was so important to things they care about. And I figured in this day and age, everyone wants to talk about jobs, workforce, entrepreneurial, leadership, innovation skills. And so what I did was I take the core science and I had to distill it down, right? Adults don't have great attention spans sometimes. Young children, it's a little more excusable.
Yeah.
Adults sometimes haven't fine-tuned their executive function skills and their focus and attention. But what I did was I distilled the brain science. And so what I'll do is I'll share, for sake of time here, that sort of quick distillation that gets people interested not only within the field of early childhood, but across all sectors. And I'm talking the World Bank, the US Chamber of Commerce, Deutsche Bank's asset management group. I mean, like, just wide range. What we now know is that babies' brains are born with again, more connections and neurons that are connecting than there are stars in the Milky Way, right? And they don't just connect randomly, it's through interactions, right? So experience and environment, and especially interactions with a caring, responsive adult, literally ends up shaping brain architecture. And that the most rapid rate of growth, right? 85% of brain growth occurs in the first 3 or so years, okay? Now, I'm always careful to say, don't oversell the concept. It's not brain development, it's brain growth. And again, that's if 85% of our development occurred in the first 3 years, we'd all be in a lot of trouble in my age.
Yes, we would.
Brain growth, to me, implies foundational structure. And so that provides us with a real opportunity, because we know that there are connecting of neurons in the developing brain, for better or for worse, based on experiences. And in fact, what I like to tell people, a lot of this based on the science, which really has been well synthesized by the Harvard Center on Developing Child, is that those connections that are made, it's not just he or she with the most connections that wins, but obviously certain connections are made in sort of a use it or lose it sort of way, right? So something that you do over and over and over again, and I like to use reading books to babies, is strengthening a pathway in much the same way that if you walked across a field of tall grass, you walk across it once, there's no real pathway there, right? All the grass just goes back to where it was. But if you walk through tall grasses over and over and over again, you really facilitate, you can get through them faster, it's much easier, there's a direct connection. And so what happens is not only are you making connections, but then starting around preschool, you start pruning away the ones that aren't used, right? And so that picture of connecting of neurons in the developing brain, understanding that especially in the first year, all the early years, and I would argue all throughout life, we do better with in-person interactions. But in that first year, one of the expressions I really like, one of the top baby brain researchers here in the US, Pat Levitt, presented with me, and he got up right before I was going to talk and said, I'm going to go over some baby brain neuroscience myths. And he said, the baby brain is not a sponge. And I went, what? Because a lot of us like to think of, like early years, this is when they are sponges. And he said, the reason it's not like a sponge is because sponges soak up everything that's around them no matter what. But the baby brain actually has what I kind of interpreted him to describe as basically a social switch, that it is through interactions you flip that switch, and then their brains function like a sponge, which means that all of us, the caring, responsive adults, play an absolutely critical role in building brain architecture and connecting neurons in the developing brain. That, in a nutshell, is the neuroscience of what I sort of distilled down for people, where I always say you have to present it sometimes like cocktail conversation. If you're at a cocktail party and you talk too much, right? Sometimes people think that they need to go like, I'm sorry, I got to go get another drink, or I have somewhere else to go, because you don't want to overwhelm them with the really cool brain science.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that was such a great, clear explanation that, you know, everybody can understand. So thank you for that. So what role then do we as educators and parents, and I mean, you just touched on that, but what can we do in our roles in the classroom or at home to help our children with their brain growth and development?
Sure. You know, so I started out very early in my career, obviously training as a pediatrician, but also I had the opportunity to work with Dr. Spock, you know, who is recognized as the world's most famous pediatrician.
Yeah.
And so what it helped me do really early on is think of a couple things. One is how to help explain things in a way that wasn't just specific to my own personal experiences in my own environment. And again, in a very globalized world, my goal is to help people understand children and positive life-enhancing ways of interacting with children that cross cultures and continents and everything else. The other thing that I realized I needed to do was to make it so that I didn't induce more guilt than parents and educators already have. And part of the challenge is that when I say, here are all the things you can or should do with your child, I know, having spent more than 20 years now in the world of parenting and giving parenting advice and insights, is that there are going to be a lot of people who immediately feel guilty, feel like they now have even more to add to their checklist of things they need to do. That is not the point. And in fact, what I did in the Toddler Brain, I outlined a framework of skills that have their foundational development in the first 5 years, that have been shown that everyone all the way up to the World Bank has declared these skills are the most important skills to succeed in today's world. It's not meant to be that, because I got a lot of pressure, including from my publisher. Where are the checklists? What things do you need to do? And what I said was I wanted it to be a way of looking at your child as their, you know, as your toddler's playing with a box, right? Yeah. Or digging in the dirt, or you're singing songs together. A way of looking at that and recognizing those sort of foundational skills in their earliest stages, and in a way taking the pressure off, because there's lots of ways to all of a sudden recognize things like curiosity, or I make the point in one of my skills about wiggle skills that physical and intellectual restlessness go hand in hand. Right. And while it's sometimes hard to appreciate a very restless child, understanding that there is a balance there, and that if you get a child to sit perfectly still and not touch or poke or grab or interact with things, that you may be losing out on some of their ability to explore and understand the world and be engaged and be curious. And those are really valuable things to not lose. So to your question about what parents and early educators can do, one is give yourself a pat on the back, right? Recognize, yes, the value of what you do, because it has been undervalued, both parents and early educators. And one of the reasons I got so deeply involved in early education and childcare was because, one, it's where kids are, right? So if that's where the kids are, I'm passionate about children and helping all children thrive. But it was also so undervalued as a profession. People didn't pay attention to it. It was basically glorified babysitting. And so trying to elevate the role that early educators play has been part of what I've been doing. And at the same time, helping early educators say, you're not just going through the motions. What you do has a powerful impact on children. And what we know, especially from my work in kids growing up in poverty and facing adversity, when I went out to Harvard Center on Developing Child and I spoke with the people there and I said, listen, you know, here in the US, there's a saying or a concept that it's gotten increasingly easy, not 100%, but very easy to predict a child's future life outcome based on the zip code they're born in. So by geography, which is poverty and race and all sorts of issues, right? So then the question becomes, how do we improve children's life outcomes? And distilling all of the factors, right? There's many. The single most important factor looks like it's a caring, responsive adult. Wow. And whether that's a 2 parents, 1 parent, great, but a caring, responsive early educator can serve that role, which is beneficial for kids who have a healthy home environment, but it is also extremely critical for the kids who may not have quite the enriching home environment that we would like all children to have. So that's my pep talk for both parents and for early educators is, again, recognizing how important the role you play is not in a guilt inducing way. Like, you better not mess this up.
Yeah.
But recognizing that all those interactions that you have with your children, walking out, taking a walk, sitting in the grass, building, a puzzle, reading books, doing whatever it is, has more impact in a positive way than a lot of people give themselves credit for.
Yeah, well, thank you for saying that, because I think a lot of people, everyone's doing their best or is trying their best. So it is really nice to hear that from an expert like yourself. So tell us, Laura, how can we, so you mentioned about these life skills that are so critical. How can these be cultivated in the early years or in preschool?
So this is where, again, people often push for what are the very specific things we can do. So I did, I conceded a little bit, and I did put lists in the Toddler Brain in each chapter. So I'll start with the first skill I talk about are me skills, which is something I would imagine you're quite interested in with your background and expertise in mindfulness, right? So first of all, it's news to some people that mindfulness, right, and self-awareness, self-control, impulse control, focus, attention, those sorts of things, but especially the mindfulness aspect is something that can be done in preschool.
Yeah.
Well, what I like to tell people is it's really gotten a lot more attention, and the neuroscience really supports it across the entire age spectrum, all the way up to the fact that there are companies like Google and SAP, global huge companies, that have chief mindfulness officers.
Right.
And the recognition there is rooted in the brain science, which is we're talking about developing a part and a function of the brain intentionally that helps us stop, think through our actions, kind of focus in a different part of the brain than whether it might be, for example, the impulsive part of our brain. And that's really valuable. So me skills are one of the things I talk about, and that does include mindfulness. And so, of course, as you are more expert than I, but I'm so intrigued with the fact that things like belly breathing and certain programs for preschoolers not only work well for all preschoolers, right? Like, I mean, it's something that's really good, and it kind of builds that foundation. But using those sorts of practices for kids who've been born and raised in environments that are very, whether it's haphazard, adverse, threatening, whatever the case might be, that you can take kids who've been exposed to that really chaotic, sort of the opposite of a peaceful, mindful environment, and they can be trained using those techniques. So in that sense, there are things you can do to cultivate skills that otherwise might not be as strong. And then, so that's the me skills. But one of the other skills I talk about is questioning and curiosity. I call them why skills, right? Again, meant to be really intuitive and apply both to those in the preschool world, but also to Fortune 100 CEOs, right? The skills everybody wants. And questioning and curiosity, I make the point that especially once we get towards preschool, one of the things that parents and early educators can do is not squelch those skills, right? Because what I tell people, and I give people framing, which is, if you think about the world today, especially the pandemic has brought this to light for people who weren't seeing it before, the world is changing very quickly. Now, in the past, when I give talks, I say technology and exponential change, and when the world's changing very quickly. But think about the fact that we've all been facing a novel virus, and that one day we might get one piece of advice, and then research is done on or people's early experiences, and then we change that advice. People don't tolerate that very well, right? I mean, change is very tough for human nature. But what it also means, you've got rapid change, and you've got lots and lots and lots of information. And in a world where you've got access to lots of information, all of a sudden, it becomes more valuable who can access it, ask good questions, because anybody with a smartphone can Google the list of answers.
Right.
That's where questioning becomes such a valuable skill. It implies curiosity and being able to ask questions based on new information. I always say, again, core executive function skills that have their most rapid rate of development between the ages of 3 and 5. And so in that point, for example, I tell people, one of the things you can do is not squelch a young child's questioning. Now, as a preschool teacher, having owned an educational childcare center for 10 years, right? 200 students, mostly 5 and under. There is a balance here. I'm not saying let kids ask questions all the time, anytime, no matter what's going on. So there's a time and a place, but to not squelch their questioning, and as opposed to taking it as they're engaged, they're interested. Sometimes they come up with things you haven't thought of. Maybe it's not the way you had planned it, but that ability to ask those questions in an appropriate, sort of way, is going to serve them well the rest of their lives. So we have a tendency as both parents and as early educators to sometimes want them to stop asking quite so many questions. And there has to be a balance there so that they don't lose that skill.
Yeah, amazing. Yeah, I think it's really interesting to hear that, and it's true, right? It goes right through life. So yeah, why not develop those things in preschool? So, Laura, can you tell us? I know what we keep reading research and about just how important the early years is on future life outcomes. I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about that.
Sure. And one of the things, and in fact, this is actually how I ended up with my affiliation with Penn State University, because I don't live in Pennsylvania, I live in the middle of the US. And so people are always sort of intrigued, like, wait, you live in Nebraska, but you've got a faculty appointment. Penn State University is one of the top universities that studies social emotional learning and skills and things, and across all areas: early childhood, K-12 education, higher education, workforce. And I came across research that was done by Mark Greenberg and Max Jones and some others, and you may know Mark Greenberg's name, very well known in that world of social emotional skills and things. And I got really excited when I saw the research, because what they had done is they looked at 20 to 25 years after kids in kindergarten had been assessed by kindergarten teachers. So just a little after preschool, right? Yeah. And they were assessed for social emotional skill development at the age of, let's say, 5 or so, okay? And it was hundreds of children. So it was a really well done study, and obviously, decades of following these children and looking at the outcomes, but hundreds of students. And and I always say, for the lay public, I say, things like sharing and playing nice with others, right? So the bread and butter routine aspects of preschool. Yeah. And then they looked at life outcomes. Right? And when I say life outcomes, I'm talking about the ones that doesn't matter if you're talking to an economist or somebody focused on job creation, life outcomes that we all care about, right? So graduation from high school, job attainment, earnings at the age of 25 for those who are interested in the economics of it, the ability to avoid teen pregnancy, drug use, involvement with the juvenile justice system, and those skills, those sort of soft, non-cognitive and other skills that that's why I created a new framework, and I called the skills key skills, QI, but pronounced like KEY. Nice. Because soft, non-cognitive and other really doesn't do them justice, right? But we all think they're important. Certainly the preschool world and parents see them and want those skills. But this study done by Mark Greenberg and his colleagues showed that they were more predictive, really impressively predictive of those future life outcomes, more so than almost any other measures we've been using. And all of a sudden, in addition to the brain science, which gives a lot of weight to what we're talking about and focusing on in those early years, having studies that look at those long-term outcomes all of a sudden becomes very valuable and really convincing to people who might not otherwise be compelled. I will tell you, and I'll keep it very short for the sake of time, telling you that in the medical world, in the pediatric world, a study done in the 90s and redone, over decades in multiple countries and things, and now really an area of focus, was called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, looking at exposure to adverse childhood experiences and predicting future life outcomes, right? And they were health outcomes: diabetes, heart disease, hypertension, obesity, all the things, the teen pregnancy and sexually transmitted diseases and things. And really impressively predicted by the number of times you were exposed to these very well-defined, abuse and neglect type experiences. When we look at those experiences, they immediately tie to a caring or not caring responsive adult or non-responsive adult interacting with children with experiences shaping brain architecture. And all of a sudden, we're at the same common denominator of those early experiences impacting not only the education, jobs, workforce trajectory, but also the health outcomes. And so all of a sudden, it's the early years. And again, my role and my goal in the last several years has to really take up that calling to make that more clear to people. Because, you know, going from early childhood to, you know, whether it's business, jobs, workforce, or, you know, lifelong, you know, problems in the health, you know, healthcare side of things, is a bit of a leap for most people. And what I try to do is connect those dots to make that so clear to people, that I can, in fact, convince them that we should be investing in early childhood. We should be supporting professions and organizations that really make sure that all children have access to the environment and the caring, responsive adults they need to thrive and be successful in the 21st century.
Yeah. Wow, wonderful. And it's so great to hear such an advocate for the early years and all the science behind that, and you know, just how important early childhood teachers are, and parents, as you mentioned before. So thank you so much, Dr. Laura A Jana. I just want to remind everyone, her book, we'll have the link to her book, The Toddler Brain, Nurture the Skills Today That Will Shape Your Child's Tomorrow, and also Jumping into Kindergarten, and her TEDx talks, all her other website and other information if you want to follow up on what she's doing. She has so much amazing, great experience and information to share with us. So thank you so much again for coming on the summit and sharing all the research and all those practical things that we can do as well. We really appreciate it.
Oh, it's my pleasure. And I hope everyone stays well and really, you know, keeps supporting kids, especially in the midst of a very rapidly changing world, global pandemic. What you do is all the more valuable.
Thank you.